Good morning. Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Heather.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Gordon.
Good
morning, everyone.
I'm trying to get my background. So let me sort that out.
So good morning, everyone. It is 10 a.m. and I see we have 50 participants inside. So, Ms. Stewart, ready to go?
Yes.
So my name is Charles Bassard. I'll be your host for today's stakeholder consultation on hazardous substances. So I'd just like to welcome everyone and thank you all for participating and being here this morning. We do have quite a few things lined up for you all. So it's going to be a lot. It's going to be a very detailed day. So we'll start off. So my name is Charles Bassard. I'm a standards officer in the standardization division. So I'll be your host for today, as I said, and we'll be getting underway shortly. So as we have everyone here, so everyone are major players within the chemical sector, and it's about developing this regional standard to give us a base by which we can implement the GHS. So that is what the two standards are about. One is a definition standard, and the next one is the labeling and character and classification standard. Those are the two things we'll be getting into today. So that's just a bit on what we'll be doing today. So we have a few presentations. So we have our chairman slash moderator, Dr. Faisal Mohammed, who's the head of the project team for hazardous chemicals. We'll be having a brief speech by Mr. Jose Trejo, the executive director of TTBS. We'll be having a presentation by Ms. Mara Abraham. Adrian? Okay. Right, we'll be having a presentation by Ms. Mara Abraham, the technical officer for standards from CrossQ. Then Ms. Dana Lewis of the BCRC will be doing a presentation, and we'll have GHS explained by Ms. Adrian Stewart, and then an overview of the draft regional standard for hazardous substances by Mr. Junior Gordon. So I would now like to welcome Mr. Jose Trejo to provide opening remarks. So I'd like to introduce Mr. Trejo. So Mr. Jose Trejo, a Belizean national with over 22 years of public service experience, including his role as an economist. Oh, my apologies. Before I introduce Mr. Trejo, I have Dr. Faisal Mohammed to introduce. My apologies there. Dr. Faisal Mohammed is an analytical chemist currently employed as a research fellow in the Department of Chemistry at UE St. Augustine, where he's responsible for the research, outreach, consulting, and analytical services, aka the ROCAS unit. He is also a part-time lecturer in the MSc Occupational Environmental Health and Safety program offered by the Department of Chemistry. Dr. Mohammed has over 15 years of experience in various types of analytical instrumentation and has authored several publications. One of his more recently co-authored publications with his student Salima Mohammed as a primary researcher is Pollution Characteristics, Risk Assessment, and Source Apportionment of Potentially Toxic Elements in Road Dust at two industrial parks in Trinidad and Tobago, West Indies. the International Scientific Journal for Environmental Monitoring and Assessment. His research interests include heavy metal and hydrocarbon pollution, contamination, and health risk assessments, the use of bioindicators for pollution evaluation, and chemical analysis of honey. Dr. Mohammed currently serves as the chairman for the regional project team, which is reviewing and finalizing the regional standards for hazardous substances. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Mohammed and give him the opportunity to say his opening remarks before I then introduce Mr. Trejo.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Again, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Mr. Prasad, for that introduction. So just as Mr. Prasad would have indicated, there's a lot of information to be disseminated today. All right, so just to kind of reiterate that the key objectives today would be, of course, to highlight the various requirements of the proposed standards, right? And of course, very important is that we hope to obtain some sort of feedback from you all as the stakeholders, right? So you are, as Mr. Prasad said, the major players for these two particular standards. Okay, so we hope that we can get as much feedback from each and every one of you all. I must just briefly commend the TTBS, CrossQ, and BCRC Caribbean for that thrust towards these two particular standards, right? And of course, the consulting team that has worked assiduously to prepare the draft standards that was then put forward to the regional team, right? Just to kind of fine tune before we disseminated that to you all for further consultation. So I look forward to the session here today. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Mohammed. So I'd just like to introduce Mr. Trejo. So Mr. Trejo, a Belizean national with over 22 years of public service experience, including his role as an economist at the Central Bank of Belize. He has worked with various government ministries in Belize, including natural resources, trade, finance, and agriculture. From 2015 to 2017, he served as chairman of the CARICOM Regional Organization for Standards and Quality and the Central American CAMET Group. He was director of the Belize Bureau of Standards from 2007 to 2023. In February 2023, he became the executive director of the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards. So, Mr. Trejo, please take it away.
Thank you, Charles, for that gracious introduction. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. All right, welcome to both our national and regional stakeholders to this consultation on hazardous substances. As the executive director of TTBS and a member of the CrossQ Council, it is my privilege to welcome all the participants to this regional stakeholder consultation to discuss two very important draft CARICOM regional standards related to hazardous substances. First, I would like to thank the CARICOM Regional Organization for Standards and Quality and the BCRC Caribbean for their collaborative efforts as part of the Jeff Islands program to spearhead the development of these two regional standards aimed at improving chemical safety management and environmental protection in the CARICOM region. TTBS is proud to host the Regional Secretariat for the development of these two regional standards, which is in alignment with our 2024-2029 strategic plan, which prioritizes environment, social, and governance matters. Therefore, we have a significant interest in ensuring that these two regional standards are developed to facilitate trade and also ensure compliance with the environmental multilateral agreements for the improved sustainability of the CARICOM region. According to the UNECE 2024, chemicals, through the different steps from their production to their handling, transport, and use, are a real danger for human health and the environment. Globally, 2 million lives and 53 million disability-adjusted life years were lost in 2019 exposure to selected chemicals, the health effects of which are well estimated according to the WHO. The ILO in 2024 highlighted that workers around the world are disproportionately exposed to chemicals across almost all sectors, with more than 1 billion workers exposed to hazardous substances, including pollutants, dust, vapors, and fumes each year. An estimated 1 million of these workers lose their lives each year due to exposure to hazardous chemicals. Children are particularly vulnerable. They account for 54% of the global burden of disease attributable to environmental exposures, again, according to the WHO. Moreover, unintentional poisonings cause an estimated 193,000 deaths each year, predominantly affecting children and young adults. Therefore, the development of these two regional standards is critical to ensure the protection of human health and the environment during the handling, transport, and use of these chemicals. Friends and colleagues, standards just don't save lives. They drive innovation. By setting clear safety benchmarks, they challenge industries to develop safer alternatives and more efficient processes. They are the invisible hand guiding us towards a safer, more sustainable future. Please allow me to outline today's agenda. Ms. Dana Lewis, BCRC Caribbean, will provide the project background. Ms. Mara Abraham, Cross-Key Secretariat, will highlight the regional standards development mandate and process. And thereafter, Mr. Junior Gordon, a member of the consultancy team, will provide a deeper look at the research methodology and findings, as well as the key requirements of the two draft standards. At this point, I would like to highlight a major milestone for TTPS with regard to improving standards, education, and implementation of the National Quality Policy 2018-2030. TTPS recently signed a Memorandum of Understanding with the University of the West Indies to formalize the long-standing partnership and aimed at strengthening the components of the national quality infrastructure and fostering collaboration in research and dissemination of standardization in tertiary level education. Therefore, I would also like to humbly thank Dr. Faisal Mohammed, who's our chairman, and Dr. Simone Walcott, our vice chair, who lead the regional project team, which comprises a cross-section of stakeholders from the CARICOM member states and is responsible for the development of these standards with support from the consultancy team. They bring a wealth of experience in the area of chemistry and represent the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus. As part of leadership provided by Trinidad and Tobago in regional standardization, Ms. Adrian Stewart and Mr. Charles Prasad are serving as the technical secretaries to the regional project team, and Ms. Stewart will be highlighting a fundamental aspect of these draft standards, which is the globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals. At this juncture, I would like to extend my deep appreciation to all the stakeholders participating in today's session. Your contributions and feedback are vital to the standards development process to ensure that we operate on the core principles of good standardization practices, consensus, transparency, and openness. We look forward to your perspectives and contributions as the feedback will assist us in refining the draft standards and ensure that they are comprehensive, practical, and applicable to both local and regional contexts. I encourage all the participants to raise any concerns and challenges. Feel free to indicate if you support and endorse these regional standards. Let us know if we are on the right track and how we can improve the draft standards. In closing, thank you once again for being here today and for your commitment to the development and application of standards that will support the safe, responsible, and sustainable use of hazardous chemicals in the CARICOM region. As a stakeholder, your involvement is crucial to the integrity and robustness of the standardization process. And I encourage you to actively participate in this and other standards development projects as we work together to build our national and regional quality infrastructure. Standards for hazardous substances are not just documents. They're a commitment to safety. It's a testament to human ingenuity and a roadmap to a safer world. Let's continue to work together to develop, implement, and improve these standards. We thank you for your time today, and I wish you a productive session. Mr. Broussard, over to you. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Trejo. So I'd like to have Dr. Mohammed come in and take over and lead today's session from here on.
Thank you, Mr. Prasad. Thank you, Mr. Trejo, for that wonderful introduction to today's session. So we're going to just continue right along with the agenda, and we actually have now remarks from CrossQ and the regional standardization process. And we have this presentation by Ms. Mara Abraham. So Ms. Mara Abraham has a distinguished career in standards development for several years. She has held leadership roles at both national and international levels. Nationally, she has served as a program manager for standards development and officer in charge at the Dominica Bureau of Standards. Regionally, first in the capacity of vice chair and subsequently as the chair of CrossQ's Technical Management Committee. Internationally, she has represented Dominica as a focal point for Codex and the International Electrotechnical Committee. Mara Abraham is the current technical officer for standards at CrossQ. With a Bachelor of Science degree in Agriculture and a Master of Science in Management Studies, Mara brings a strong foundation in both technical expertise and organizational leadership to her role. I now invite Ms. Abraham to give her presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed, and good morning to all. Mr. Trejo, the Executive Director of the TTBS, Dana and the BCRC team, and the team from the TTBS. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the CARICOM Regional Organization for Standards and Quality, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all the participants at this regional webinar. Let me first extend our gratitude to the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards and the BCRC Caribbean for this partnership in hosting this webinar. For those of you who do not know, CrossQ is the CARICOM Regional Organization for Standards and Quality. We are a regional intergovernmental organization which was established in February of 2002 under the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, Article 67. CrossQ is located in Barbados, and our membership comes from the national standards body in the region. So the 15 member states of the region, that is the make up the membership of CrossQ. We also work very closely with the DR, in which we are then considered to be CARI Forum. CrossQ's mission is working together to facilitate the growth, resilience, and sustainable development of CARICOM through the advancement of internationally recognized regional quality infrastructure. Our vision is transforming and empowering the lives through standards and quality. CrossQ and the BCRC entered into a letter of agreement to collaborate on Component 1, Output 14 of the Jeff Islands program within their respective sphere of competence and jurisdiction. The cooperation is critical in supporting our CARICOM member states in strengthening their ability to control the flow of chemicals, products, and materials into the region and ensure the safe management of chemicals and waste. Under the collaboration between the CrossQ and the BCRC, CrossQ was charged to lead the development of 2 CARICOM regional standards for hazardous chemicals in materials, products, and waste relevant to the Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm, and Minamata conventions. The standards would have been developed following CrossQ's regional standards development process. The 2 standards which were developed are the DCRS 80, which is the terminology and definition for hazardous substances and products containing hazardous substances, and the DCRS 81, hazardous substances and products containing hazardous substances, classification and labeling. Now let's look at that regional standards development process, which would have been followed to develop these standards. So as I would have said, the BCRC and CROSCU entered into a letter of agreement. That would have happened during our 8-stage process. So the CROSCU, the regional development process is an 8-stage process. So the preliminary stage would have involved the development of the establishment of that collaboration. It would have involved BCRC obtaining or procuring the consultants. The consultants would have done a lot of research to determine the standards that would have been developed. They came up with 4 standards, I believe, and 2 of those were selected for the initial stages. This obtained validation, and from there we would have gone into the proposal stage, have developed what we call the NWIP, or the new work item proposal. That is part of the proposal stage of the process. During that stage, that document, that NWIP, would have then been sent out to member states, and member states would have given their endorsement to proceed with the development of that particular standard. During that stage as well, we would have also established what would have been called the regional project team, which, as you would have heard, Dr. Mohammed is the chair. Mr. Trejo would have outlined the expertise that are on that particular project team. So that is what a project team would encompass. The experts within that particular sector providing input. During the stage of the preparatory stage, that is where the consultants would have come back in and start developing a draft. Well, they would have developed 2 drafts in that case of the standards that would have been submitted to that original project team. During the committee stage, that's where the project team would then have reviewed the drafts, the working drafts that the consultants would have developed, added input to it, added any salt and pepper, any flavoring to it. And this is what we have now as the draft. So currently we are at stage 40, which is the inquiry stage, which is where the member states now have the opportunity to provide their input on that standard, which is what this webinar essentially is looking at, giving you an opportunity to find out more information about the standard and be able to provide comments. Those comments will then be taken back to the RPT, who will review each comment individually and accept or not accept the standard, the comment, sorry. If the comments are accepted, they will be included within the document. If they are not accepted, the project team has the responsibility to indicate why it was not accepted. Once all the comments have been inputted into the standard, they will develop what they call the final draft, and that will go to the next stage, which is the approval stage, in which that document is now again circulated to member states, and the member states, you again have an opportunity to ensure that all the comments that you would have provided was inputted into that document, and now the document is of a sound and robust document that can be used. Once member states have indicated yes, the document is then submitted to CROSCU Council, for which Mr. Trejo said he's a part of, to recommend that standard to COTED. COTED is the Council of Trade and Economic Development Ministers, and they are the ones who have the final say of approving the standard as a regional standard. Once the approval has been obtained, we will go into what we call the publication stage, meaning that The document will be edited. It will be put in a manner that you as the stakeholders can now access and use. Of course, we know that things are constantly changing. There's new research, there is new technologies. So what will happen is after a period of about 4 to 5 years, the standard will be reviewed. It may happen before or it may happen after. During that review process, what we will look at is whether or not anything has changed. Has the document met its objective? Is it still in keeping with what is technically valid? And a decision will be made as to whether to revise the document, revise or amend the document, to withdraw the document, that is meaning that it doesn't meet its needs anymore and it's no longer needed, or to reaffirm, meaning that nothing has changed and the document can continue to proceed as is. So that will be the 8 stages through which this document will proceed. So on behalf of CrossQ, I would like to thank the BCRC, the consultant team led by Mr. Ramon Marjorinan, the members of the regional project team, and the Trinidad and Tobago's Bureau of Standards for the leadership provided as the host secretariat during the development of the draft standards thus far. And we as CrossQ look forward to the completion of these documents. I also want to encourage you, the stakeholders, to use the information which will be provided today to review the documents and provide comments through your various member states so that the final document which will be developed are robust and meet the needs of the region. So thank you very much. Back to you, Dr. Prasad.
All right, thank you, Ms. Abraham. Because you would have provided a lot of detail into the various steps that goes into the implementation of these standards. So as you all can see, there's a lot of planning involved in this particular process. And based on the stages, we are somewhere, I guess, in the middle of the whole scenario. And of course, this is where your input is now required. And Ms. Abraham basically just kind of set the tone now for the main aspects of the session here today. All right, now as you all can see from the agenda, we do have a question and answer session later on. So we will have the various presentations, right? And then we will be able to have that question and answer session. However, if it is that during a particular presentation, you have any question, you can feel free to type it in the chat, or you can hold until the Q&A session. The option is yours. And then once it's in the chat, we will take it accordingly at that particular point in time. Okay, so moving on, we actually have the project summary from BCRC Caribbean. And I will be inviting Ms. Dana Lewis, who is the Project Execution Officer 1, to give her presentation on this particular aspect. Now, Ms. Lewis holds a BSc in Geography and Environmental Natural Resource Management and is currently pursuing an MPhil in Geography at the University of the West Indies. After working as a demonstrator for Geographical Information Systems and Natural Hazards at UWI, Ms. Lewis joined the BCRC Caribbean team in February 2022. She is currently a Project Execution Officer 1 at the Center, supporting with the execution of the Jeff Island program in the Caribbean region. Under the Caribbean projects, Ms. Lewis leads the activities under environmentally sound management of end-of-life vehicles, the implementation of the globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals, and this activity that supports the development of the 2 CARICOM regional standards led by CrossQ. So I now invite Ms. Dana Lewis to give her presentation here this morning.
Good morning, Dr. Mohammed and everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm just awaiting permission to share, so if you'd allow me 2 minutes and I'll share the presentation shortly. Okay, good morning again, everyone. Thank you again for the introduction. And thank you also to the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards, to CrossQ, the team of consultants, and also you, our stakeholders, for taking the time to attend this meeting today. And it is a pleasure for us to be able to share with you a bit about the Jeff Islands program and also the activities specifically on developing these two CARICOM regional standards. So along with the presentation, and we'll go into a brief overview of the Jeff Islands program and the scope of this activity. So ISLAND stands for Implementing Sustainable Low and Non-Chemical Development in Small Island Developing States. This is actually a global program where the projects are being implemented in 4 different SIDS regions across the world. So this would be the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Caribbean. And the BCRC Caribbean is the executing agency for this project in the Caribbean region. We are executing 2 projects in a synergized manner. That will be Jeff 10279 and Jeff 10472, with 12 countries participating over those 2 projects. And I'll share a bit about which countries those are in a little bit. So under the Jeff 10279 and 10472 projects, there are 4 major components. And under these components, we aim to achieve certain points. The first being under component 1, the prevention of the future buildup of chemicals that are entering small island developing states. And under this component, we aim to do a couple of things, such as providing or improving rather our legislative and institutional capacity for managing chemicals and waste. And we also aim to support countries with better understanding the different multilateral environmental agreements that deal with the management of chemicals and waste. So this will include the Basel Convention, the Minamata Convention, and also Rotterdam and Stockholm as well. In terms of component 2, the safe management and disposal of existing chemicals, products, and materials. Under this component, we aim to strengthen our capacity to deal with things like obsolete pesticides and different chemicals such as PCBs or polychlorinated biphenyls. And also we aim to manage hazardous waste that are coming into our region. In terms of component 3, the safe management of products that are entering small island developing states and closing that material and product loop. Here we aim to implement things such as the extended producer responsibility scheme, or the producer pays principle, and also the management of waste streams such as end-of-life vehicles or e-waste. And the final component deals with the knowledge management and communication component. And here we aim to develop knowledge products and different infographics, videos, all kind of informational products that we hope to share not only within the region, but globally to highlight the work that we are doing under the project as it relates to chemicals and waste management. So in terms of the objective specifically for this activity on the development of 2 CARICOM regional labeling standards, this falls under component 1. And the objectives are to develop those 2 standards as well as 12 national implementation roadmaps to support with the development of the standards that are selected. And these 12 national roadmaps will be for the 12 countries that are participating in the 2 projects. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 12 countries, and you can see them here displayed on the map that are participating across the Jeff 10279 and 10472 projects. But we recognize that since we are collaborating with CrossQ and we're developing CARICOM regional standards, this would be applicable to all 15 CARICOM member states. So for this reason, under the project, we have also given consideration to the 5 additional countries that are not a part of islands, but still very relevant as it relates to the development of these 2 standards. So that would be in addition to the 12, Grenada, Haiti, Jamaica, Montserrat, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So Ms. Abraham would have mentioned earlier that the BCRC and CrossQ do have a letter of agreement in terms of our collaboration for the development of these 2 standards. So in terms of our different areas of responsibility, CrossQ will lead the development of the 2 CARICOM regional standards as they are following CrossQ's regional standards development process. And the BCRC Caribbean will lead the assessment phase of the project towards the prioritization of the 2 standards. And this was done in collaboration with the consultants that we would have hired for this purpose. And also with the development of the roadmaps, the BCRC Caribbean will also be leading that with voluntary support from CrossQ. So just a little bit on the activity focal points. So noting again that the BCRC Caribbean is the executing agency for the islands projects in the Caribbean. My name is Dana Lewis, and I'm the activity lead as it relates to this project on developing the 2 labeling standards. So if you ever want to find out more information on those things or on the progress of the activity overall, my email is also provided on screen, and I am supported by my colleague, Ms. Shalina Rublal, who you'll hear from a bit later during the question and answer portion. And also the team of consultants that we would have hired, led by Mr. Ramon Madranan and supported by Mr. Junior Gordon and some other members of the team. And you'll hear from Mr. Gordon also later in this same meeting. So just to give you a brief overview of the actual work plan for this project activity. So Ms. Abraham would have outlined previously the timeline or the work plan for the development of the standards. Well, while that was actually happening, the consultants and their work plan was also progressing, starting with an inception workshop where we officially kicked off this activity in March of last year, 2023. And following that, the consultants would have done an assessment to really select the 2 standards that would be developed further. As Ms. Abraham indicated, there were 4 options, but to get to those 4 options, they first had to conduct an assessment to understand where the gaps were in the region and what standards would be necessary to be developed to support our chemicals and waste management and the management of hazardous waste entering the region. So the consultants would have done the assessment and based on that, presented that information and the 2 standards that were selected out of all the options to the national working groups that are supporting us with this project moving forward. And they would have had a validation workshop where we received feedback from our national stakeholders. And based on that, they would have supported again with the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards as the Secretariat to submit the new work item proposals and advance with the development of these 2 standards. Subsequent to that, and in between, we would have also had meetings between CrossQ, the TTBS, the consultant team, and the BCRC. And after all of those, we would have then had the phase of the regional technical subcommittee meetings with representatives from the countries that indicated their willingness to support with the development of the standards. And now we're in the virtual public consultations phase where we hope to receive any feedback that you all have on the standards that will be presented a bit later. And in parallel, we will now be ongoing the phase of the development of the 12 national roadmaps led by the consulting team, where once these 2 standards are completed, the roadmaps will support each country in guiding them on how to actually implement these regional standards nationally, how they choose to adapt or adopt the standards and implement it within their different national contexts. So in terms of the deliverables that the consulting team would have supported with preparing thus far, I mentioned the inception workshop. So they also did an inception workshop report. They also did a report on the assessment that they conducted across the 12 countries, the validation workshop, and they've also supported with drafting the 2 standards that were then refined by the committee for this committee draft that will now be reviewed by you all. In terms of the other deliverables, they did meeting summary notes on the different meetings of the RPT or the regional project team, and also a summary report on the information that was gathered when they met with each country to start crafting those 12 national roadmaps that I mentioned. And also as part of the project, they are asked to do quarterly reports on the general progress of their work moving forward, both on the development of the standards and the development of the national roadmaps. So in terms of the next steps, we recognize that once we receive all the public comments that come in on the two standards, the consulting team will support with refining the committee draft to actually have a final draft standard that will be proposed for acceptance. And in addition to that, the consulting team will now be going on national missions to each of the 12 project countries that are part of the Jeff Islands program that will support the development of the 12 national roadmaps. So again, the questions will be answered. We are happy to answer them at the end during the question and answer period. And we wanted to leave you with this resource, the Jeff Islands activity or the Global Jeff Islands program. You can feel free to visit jeffislands.org or the BCRC Caribbean website for more information. So thank you all so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions at the end of the meeting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ms. Lewis, for that excellent presentation and providing those very specific details into the implementation of these two regional standards, and of course the next steps, towards its actual finalization. So we are moving right ahead because we are a few minutes just off schedule, but we will be moving into the explanation of the GHS, which will be done by Mrs. Adrienne Stewart of the TTBS. Now, Mrs. Stewart has served the TTBS for almost 18 years and has been involved in the development of national, regional, and international standards. She has functioned as technical secretary to several regional standards projects, including those for sodium hypochlorite solution, pesticides labeling, and more recently, the one for hazardous substances. And of course, she is very familiar to all of us here. So I now invite Ms. Stewart to give her presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. Good morning, everyone. Let me get my presentation on share mode. So as Dr. Mohammed said, I'm going to be talking about the globally harmonized system for classification and labeling of chemicals of the United Nations, commonly called the GHS. And this morning, I'm going to be looking at the genesis of the GHS approach, hazard classification and hazard communication, implementation of the GHS, and what are the next steps for the standards. So the genesis of the GHS. Now, a gentleman by the name of Thomas Huxley, who was a biologist, he said, logical sequences are the scarecrows of fools and the beacons of wise men, meaning that wise men look at systems, issues, processes to see what are the logical consequences and try to put systems in place to ensure that they mitigate against any danger or any adverse effects. And Ayn Rand, who was a biologist, she said, we can ignore reality, but we cannot ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. And the GHS helps us to not ignore reality so that we are well able to deal with the consequences of adverse effects of hazardous substances. And so the global issues that would have accelerated or led to the development of the GHS included a massive, complex global chemical industry. At this moment, the statistics organizations in the UK and the US value the industry at $6 trillion US, and that's quite a lot. When the GHS was first developed in 2002, it was the industry was valued at $3 trillion US. So we can see how the industry has grown. And the supply chains are very complex and intertwined. But there are different laws in different countries, different labels and SDS sheets that were being used at the time, differences in the definition of hazards. And of course, this would have an impact on trade and safety, and especially on safety, because if a product is deemed to be flammable in one country and not flammable in another country, or an environmental hazard in one country and not an environmental hazard in another country, then we understand how accidents can happen, or we can have emergency situations, and how we can have adverse consequences. So why do we need to harmonize? Of course, is a logical consequence. There was a need. All standards are developed because there is a need. And so there was a need to harmonize systems for hazardous chemicals or hazardous substances across the globe, wherein you would need a single global, there was need for a single global system, which was understood by all. There was a need to improve communication on chemicals. There was the need to address workplace and employee protection. There was the need to provide for the end user and homes information that they could use to protect themselves, their families, and so on. A need for accurate and complete information to be provided for trade, and a more comprehensive focus on transportation of hazardous substances. So in 1992, the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development issued an international mandate calling for the development of a globally harmonized chemical classification and labeling system. And basically, what the mandate was in the article was for a globally harmonized hazard classification and compatible labeling system, including material safety data sheets at the time. Now it's safety data sheets, and easily understandable symbols should be available, if feasible, by the year 2000. So who were the persons who were called into this new committee that was developed by the UNCED? And where were they from? And how were they able to develop the GHS? Well, basically, most of the participants on the committee at the time, what the UNCE did was form a multinational coordinating group. And this was chaired by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration of the USA. And there were several countries, international organizations, stakeholder organizations, and experts on this, in this coordinating group, serving on this coordinating group. There were experts in all areas of the current GHS: toxicology, explosives, fire protection, health and safety, chemistry, and even communications, just to name a few of the areas of expertise that were lended to this particular GHS. The GHS was based on an existing system, as mostly in standardization, we do not always start from scratch. If there are existing documents, we use those documents. And so the US requirements for workplace consumers and pesticides were already in existence. The Canadian requirement for workplace consumers and pesticides, European Union directives for classification and labeling of substances and preparations, and the United Nations recommendation on the transport of dangerous goods. These form the basis of the work on the GHS. And the key guiding principles were: protection of existing systems would not be reduced as a result of the GHS. So it means that those countries which already had systems in place, laws and legislation in place, these existing systems would not be reduced. GHS was there to enhance the system and make them more robust and make them more accurate and more efficient. Number two, it will be based on intrinsic properties of hazards of chemicals. All types of chemicals will be covered. All systems will have to be changed, and that is all systems relating to the identification of hazards. Those are the identification of hazards of chemicals. Those are the systems that would need to be changed, not the existing systems that are overall overarching and providing overseeing of the industry. Involvement of all stakeholders should be ensured. Comprehensibility must be addressed. There must be an understanding across the board. Existing data about chemicals and methods for testing chemicals should be accepted and adapted. Confidential business information should be protected as prescribed by competent authorities. So the scope of the GHS is harmonized criteria for classifying substances and mixtures according to their health, physical, and environmental hazards. And 2, harmonized hazard communication elements, including requirements for labeling and safety data sheets. So in 2002, the GHS was adopted, and the UN Committee of Experts on Transport and Dangerous Goods and on the globally harmonized systems of classification and labeling of chemicals all agreed to adopt the GHS in 2002. The GHS is updated every 2 years, and there are options for legislation and standard setting. And as you can see in the region, we are beginning the process by standards setting, using the GHS 4 standard setting. 67 countries have adopted elements of the GHS, including the EU in 2008. They're aligned to the GHS. In 2012, OSHA USA, they're aligned with how they develop and write their SDS. In 2013, China adopted 28 standards aligned to revision 4. In 2022, Canada, they accepted revision 7, and now they're moving towards revision 8. In 2024, the GHS is at the 10th revision. And I'll explain a little later about why different countries adopt different revisions and what that means. Okay, so the GHS approach. The GHS approach was to define, which is to define and standardize the health, physical, and environmental hazards of a chemical, to create the classification processes that will provide access to available data on chemicals, and to communicate and deliver the safety data information on protective measures and the protective measures on labels. So how were chemicals classified at the time and continued to be classified? Now, there are several steps which were undertaken. And as I said, the first is to define. So you identify and obtain data on the hazards of a chemical. Determine if the chemical is hazardous based on the physical health and environmental hazards. Test the chemical, or consult scientific evidence, or consult with users of the product. That's also one methodology that's included. Of course, that's done on a scientific basis. Identify the hazard classes and identify the appropriate hazard categories. And of course, as with any standard, the classification is due for improvement. And as I said, every 2 years, it's reviewed to ensure that the hazard associated with a substance and mixture is up to date, that data is compared, and that if there is need for improvement in the classification system itself, or improvement within a hazard, because a chemical in 2002 may have not been considered carcinogenic, but in 2024 it is considered carcinogenic, and therefore the degree of hazard has changed, and so it has to be changed within the GHS as well. So the classification starts with a classification hazard or group, and then there is a classification class from that hazard or group, and from the classification class, there are hazard categories. And these are based on the level of danger and based on the GHS criteria, which have already been established. And so this helps to identify the properties of the hazardous product. There are 17 physical group types. There are 10 health types and 2 environmental hazard types. So in all, if my math is correct, there are 29 hazard group types that have been identified by the GHS. Under health, there are 10, and these 10 are divided into hazard class. So for example, you can have acute toxicity or carcinogenicity. Those are just 2 of the 10 hazard classes that come under the health group type. And from the acute toxicity, now you get 5 hazard categories. From the carcinogenic hazardgenicity, hazard class, there are two types of hazard categories. And just to give you an example of how it, it all stacks up and work together. And within acute toxicity, if we follow the same trending of thought, the hazard, which is a hazard class, there are cutoff limits that are used based on the exposure routes, and the estimated toxicity is included. And this is how you delineate where there's a hazard category 1, hazard category 2 to hazard category 5. And from this now, when we have determined all of this information, the classification and where everything sits, then we move on to communication. And communication is by a number of means, but for products, it's by labeling and the safety data sheet. And under the labeling, there are label elements, which are symbols, words, statements, and precautionary statements and other product identifier. And so under the SDS, there are similar elements, but in addition, you have the chemical identification of substances and mixtures, and the suppliers information. You have exposure control, personal protection, toxicological information, first aid measures, regulatory and other information that are required by the particular country in which the product is produced or going to be used. And these are your hazard symbols. There are in total 9 hazard symbols. Some of them overlap. So for example, you have 5 physical hazards, 4 health hazard symbols, and 1 environmental hazard symbols. And each symbol comes with what we call a signal word, which shows the level of severity. And the signal words are danger for chemicals with more severe or significant hazards, warning for chemicals with less severe hazards, and usually on a label, the hazard symbol and the hazard signal words would be placed close to each other, as would the hazard statement. The GHS does not necessarily tell you how to write your label as what comes where, what goes where, but it does stipulate that the hazard symbols, the signal words, and the hazard statements need to be grouped together. The hazard statements they tell the GHS classes and categories, and they basically state the nature of the hazard. And so you have statements like toxic if swallowed is a hazard, and this is a hazard statement of acute toxicity. And if I go back to, if I go forwards to this example on acute toxicity, we will see, for example, here, for a category, which is an oral category, hazard category 1, it says fatal if swallowed. But in hazard category 3, under the same oral requirement, you will see toxic if swallowed. And this is how the GHS will lay it out in terms of the hazard statements. But the GHS have other statements as well, and they're called the precautionary statements. And they're for information about the chemical, and they tell you how to use the chemical safely, how to prevent adverse outcomes, how to respond to emergencies, how to store the chemical, and how to dispose of the chemical. So it's important to note the difference between the two types of statements. One statement, which is the hazard statement, it tells you the nature of the hazard, the degree of the hazard. The precautionary statement tells you the actions to take to prevent or minimize adverse effects of a chemical. And these are also included on the label. So if there's a product that is going to be on your clothing, it can tell you stuff like, if you're going to be spraying pesticides, for example, it will tell you if your clothing gets contaminated, then you need to take your clothing off immediately, or it may tell you have a shower, or, you know, it may tell you that you need to wash your eyes out immediately, or if the product gets into your eye, it may tell you consult a doctor immediately, depending on what the particular issue is and the particular chemical based on the category of the hazard. Now, for the hazard statements, they have numbers, and the numbers indicate the hazard that is being advised on. So, for example, an H before the numbers would indicate that it's a health hazard, and P before precautionary statement would just include that, will just make you note that it's a precaution. And it's an alphanumerical code which is used. However, when the information is placed on the label, the alphanumeric code is not used. The alphanumeric code is just to be able to identify the particular statement. And so I would have shown where different categories of hazards would have different hazard statements. Implementation. Implementation of the GHS is, of course, based on the classification, and the classification gives way to hazard communication, and then all of this works together for the formulation of a risk management system, whether it's in manufacturing, whether it's in distribution, shipping, use, that it is what it is. Even for homes, the risk management system would be, if you have small children, you lock your chemicals away in a place where the children can't get to, and that would be communicated. That is one of the requirements actually on all labels of chemicals. The building block approach. Now, the good thing about the GHS is that it has what is called a building block approach, wherein you don't have to take all of the GHS into account all at the same time. You can build from small blocks, and you can make the system fit the needs of your country, of your organization, because it is structured in such a way that you can take elements, you can take a hazard class, and you can take one category from the hazard class, and you can start there to build the system that you require to ensure safe product use. However, it has to be consistent in its approach. If you're going to take a hazard category from a hazard class and build based on that particular hazard category, you have to start with the highest hazard category. That is, you're starting with the most hazardous of the products within that particular hazard class. And it also means that you have to ensure that you have the communication, that is the symbols, the statements that are in line with that particular hazard category. And countries may decide that they want to prioritize one hazard class or hazard categories over others based on whatever their priorities are, based on whatever existing regulations they have, based on their national resources and capability. So the building block approach is, you start with your hazard class, you move to your hazard categories, you look at your cutoff values or concentration limits based on your categories, what you think is relevant to your country, and then you move on to your hazard communication from that, and of course, your risk management systems. So this is just an example of what can be. If you use if we're going to start off with a hazard class of acute toxicity, we may decide that we're going to use hazard up to hazard class 3, 1, 2, and 3 of the 5 categories. Then you look across the cross section of stakeholders that we're going to be building this particular part of the system for, and then decide what communication systems you need. And you may actually just decide you're going to do transport alone, or consumers alone, or workplace and consumers. It's a very lovely integrated system, and the building block approach really helps in moving forward so that it's not overwhelming to any system which is already in place. So what are our next steps? Ms. Abraham would have outlined the standardization process, and we are currently at the inquiry stage, which is August to October 2024. And that's why we're having, part of the reason why we're having this consultation, so that persons can become familiar with the standards and know that the standards are there for comment, read the standards and provide feedback to your member states, your national standards bodies in your particular relevant member states. So what we want to do is ensure that by the 6th of October, we have all our comments in, and post-inquiry, and then move on to post-inquiry, which is where the committee reconvenes, consider all the comments that have come in, and update the standard to suit, so that the standard can go out for member state vote in January to February 2025, so that we can have final approval from the TMC committee, which is a technical management committee of CROSSQ, from the Council of CROSSQ, and then have the standard go to COTED for final approval by the Ministers of Trade and Development. And that this is our timeline moving forward, and we're hoping to stick to this timeline because we need to get the standards to COTED by May 2025 in order to meet the deliverables of the island projects. Okay, so thank you very much. I know I said a lot and it was very fast and furious, but I do hope that we were able to grasp a little bit of how the GHS actually works and how it can be taken into national systems on a building block approach. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Ms. Stewart, for that very comprehensive breakdown of the GHS. I'm sure that you all would agree that that information was very helpful, and it gives us all a better insight into the GHS. Moving right along, we would have the overview of the draft regional standards. And before I invite Mr. Gordon from the consultancy team, just a reminder that if you have any questions, feel free to post it in the chat, or you can wait for the question and answer session that would take place right after Mr. Gordon's presentation. All right, so Mr. Junior Gordon has been a consultant and public sector executive for over 30 years in the field of standards, metrology, and conformity assessment, with understanding of the World Trade Organization, technical barriers to trade agreement, and its application. He directed the improvement and expansion of the metrology portfolio of the Bureau of Standards Jamaica from 2009 to 2015, and also served as CARIMET Technical Working Group Chair. Mr. Gordon prepared the drafts and spearheaded the approval of Jamaica's updated national quality policy between 2016 and 2019, and is currently coordinating the implementation of that policy. Mr. Gordon is a graduate of UE with an MPhil degree in chemistry and has over 16 years experience as a university academic program director and lecturer in structural design, project management, and strategic waste management. Mr. Gordon is a member of BCRC's regional standards consultancy team for the development of standards for hazardous substances. So I now invite Mr. Junior Gordon to give his presentation.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mohammed. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, all of our team members. I am going to begin to share my screen at this point. Okay, and let me get my presentation to slideshow. All right, great. Thank you all. I am going to begin by saying that the process that we have been through to come to this point have been adequately covered by Mara, by Dana, and by Adrian. And so I will just make very passing comments on that. and then get you into the standard as soon as we possibly can. So in terms of introduction, most of this has been said by Dana already, but I'll pick up the second paragraph there. After we did our intensive research and assessment of the appropriate standards and regulations and legislation and so on from the Caribbean and other parts of the world, because we had to go there to ensure that we had a good understanding of what takes place in other regions and in other countries of the world as they seek to comply with the multilateral environmental agreements, i.e. the Minamata, the Basel, the Stockholm, and the Rotterdam conventions, right? So after we had done all of that, we then came down to the point where we were able to recommend standards. And I know that both Mara and Dana spoke of the 4 standards that we came down to, but I would want to add that we considered possibly about 30 standards, about 30 possible standards, and we use a multi-criteria analysis to drill that down and reduce that to about 4, and then further analysis of the 4 to bring it down to 2 proposed standards. And subsequently to all of that work, the standards preparation has been basically following the CrossQ fast track process and has been carefully and proactively managed by the TTBS, which is the Regional Technical Secretariat for Standards on Chemicals. So that's all I'll say in terms of introduction. And then to just move quickly to the objective. In this objective has already been posted by Dana to develop 2 CARICOM regional labeling standards and 12 national implementation roadmaps to support the countries with the voluntary implementation of such standards and the development of others under the relevant MEAs. And I want to just zero in on that final part of the objective that speaks to the development of other standards and regulations, because as we looked at what we needed to do in this region, we realized that we need some base standards, some standards that once we have them in place, the information in them could then serve as springboards for the development of further or additional standards and regulations and even legislation within the region and within the different member states. All right. So through our assessment phase, as I said earlier, we looked at standards, regulations, legislations, etc. We looked at them nationally, we looked at regionally, and we looked at what they looked like internationally as well. And we further drilled down to look at the usefulness of standards for compliance with the different requirements of the conventions that I spoke about before. How useful were standards in doing that? And as I said, we then looked at a whole range of possible standards that could be of benefit to the region. And we use a multi-criteria analysis to drill down from there to the 2 standards with the best potential to satisfy the objectives that we were given. And obviously from there, we went on to the new work item proposals, the draft standards, and the working with the RPT and so on. So what are the 2 draft CARICOM regional standards that have been prepared? The names were mentioned before. This is a draft CARICOM standard, terminology and definitions for hazardous substances and products containing hazardous substances. And the other one is the Draft CARICOM Regional Standard, Hazardous Substances and Products Containing Hazardous Substances, Classification and Labeling. So those are the two standards that we are talking about this morning. So for the terminology and definition standard, the purpose is really to build a common understanding and usage of terminology, common usage of terminology in relation to hazardous substances. And Adrian did speak about some of the problems that can happen when we don't have common understanding of usage of terms and so on. Okay, and so we intend to do that in the standard by harmonizing with the globally accepted definitions of terms. Well, first of all, to use the terms, and not just to use them, but to use them with the globally understood understanding and definition of what those terms mean. Okay, and to provide a base standard on which the region as a whole and member states in particular can develop other standards, regulations, and legislation as may be necessary for meeting their obligations under the MEAs. The scope. The scope of the standard is as follows, and I think this is written into the standard, so you will find it there. The standard gives general terms, abbreviations, and acronyms together with their internationally accepted definitions as used in reference to hazardous substances and products containing hazardous substances, and as contained in the normative reference documents that are listed in the standard. It also gives specific terms, abbreviations, and definitions related to 4 multilateral environmental agreements, and they're listed there. So the standard, the scope then speaks to the general terminology and also to the specific terminology. All right, and so the standard is divided that kind of way. Where did we get the information from for the preparation of this standard? So we made use of the applicable terminology, abbreviations, and definitions as outlined, first of all, in the 4 reference MEAs. So in the Basel Convention on the control and transboundary movement of hazardous waste and their disposal, and together with the Basel Convention's glossary of terms, that provided quite a substantial list of terms and definitions. The Minamata Convention on Mercury also, Rotterdam Convention on the prior informed consent procedure for certain hazardous chemicals and pesticides in international trade, and the Stockholm Convention on persistent organic pollutants. So this is where our base documents were. But in addition to those, we got other important information, other significant definitions also came from the globally urbanized system, the GSS, right? And the GHS Guide Glossary, and also the International Labour Organization's Glossary of Terms for Chemical Safety. Okay. So how is the standard structured? The standard, it contains 5 technical clauses. The general terminology is applicable under all of the MEAs, that's clause 3. Then we have the specific terminology for each of the 4 conventions. We begin with the Basel Convention, then the Minamata in clause 5, then the Rotterdam in clause 6, and the Stockholm in clause 7, and the listing is not in order of any importance. It's just alphabetically, right? That they're listed there. So what does the standard contain that is important for us to understand how it is used? So in addition to providing the internationally accepted meanings of the terms, abbreviations, and acronyms, each clause in the standard gives explanations and some examples. In some cases, examples would be necessary, right? To allow the user of the standard to get a good understanding of what the terms mean. So we don't just give the terms and the meaning, but we provide explanations and also examples as may be needed in the standard. And in clause 4 in particular, for the Basel Convention, it provides substantial explanations of some of the terms and their meanings. All right, so when you look there, you will see that. But also we want to make the point that for any particular definition, the explanations and examples that are provided in the standards, we didn't just pluck them from, but we use those that were obtained from the source documents, right? So for a definition of any particular term, the source document for that definition would contain explanations and, if necessary, examples. And it is those explanations and examples that are given in the standard. Okay. So that's the terminology and definitions standard. It's a base on which we can build that common understanding across the region and therefore proceed with the development of other standards. And the next standard number 2, is the classification and labeling of hazardous substances and products containing hazardous substances. So what's the purpose of the standard? And you'd have seen these symbols already. I think Adrian had them up in her presentation there. And it is to facilitate the implementation of safe practices in the production, distribution, use, and disposal of hazardous substances. We intend to do that by specifying the standard classification and labeling criteria for hazardous substances and products containing hazardous substances based on the types of hazards that they present. So that's our purpose. Source document, essentially the source of the information for this standard is the UNGHS 10th revised edition. Hence, Adrian's presentation on that particular document, because it is the basis of the standard totally. Now, the GHS is a big document, and it was produced through significant international collaboration, and it continues to be revised every 2 years through that same kind of collaboration. And therefore, it does contain a lot of information, a lot of useful information. It contains verified and verifiable information, all right? And so the consultant team, we took considerable time on looking at the best route to take in adopting this big document into a standard which would, first of all, be of the most value to the Caribbean region. And obviously, we want it to be more user-friendly than the full volume of the GHS, because the full volume of the GHS you can always access. In looking at how we could do the adoption or adaptation, we looked at a standard from Singapore, SS 586-2, particularly part 2 globally harmonized system for classification and labeling of chemicals. And based on that standard and our how they approached it, and also based on the needs, the understanding of the needs of the region, as we did a survey among the member states, we did a survey seeking for information, and we got the results of that survey. And when we looked at all of that together with how the approach was with the Singapore standard, we adopted the approach wherein that the specific hazard categories that are reflective of our national and regional needs would be adopted, or we would do another adaptation of them, right? And in so doing, we would need to reference the GHS extensively in the document. And then from the GHS, we would only reproduce the areas of the GHS that are most critical in addressing the national and regional needs. As I said, some of those that we obtained from our survey of what exists in the region. And so it makes sense to just look at what is the difference between what we are proposing in this draft standard and what was done with the Singapore standard. Essentially, we are doing the same thing, but emphasizing different areas. So we both adopt the GHS building blocks as needed. We both refer extensively to the GHS for both classification and labeling. But while the Singapore standard reproduces the GHS classification criteria, for our purpose, we felt it better to refer to the classification criteria and reproduce the labeling elements, while the Singaporeans would refer to the labeling elements. And this might be the reason for this, for the Singaporean standard going that direction is dependent on who the main users of the standard are intended to be. So what is the rationale for the difference then? We're saying that hazard classification is the responsibility of manufacturers, importers, distributors. In other words, the people who put the products on the market. Those are the ones who have the responsibility for classification. But the general public may not understand or need to interface with the classification process. What they will need to understand and interface with is the label that is on the product. All right. And so for these reasons, we decided to place the label requirements in the standard. Right? And so we can move now to look quickly at the content. So the standard carries an introduction, and in the introduction there is the GHS building block system is presented in tabular form, and just an excerpt is shown here. As we look at the different hazard classes and the different categories. The scope of the standard. And the standard prescribes the requirements for those who have the responsibility to classify and label, right? To appropriately classify and label hazardous chemicals, substances, mixtures, and products that contain hazardous chemicals, both those that are produced in our region or imported into the region. And this has to be done before being offered for sale on the local market, transported within the member state or the region, or used in industrial, commercial, or agricultural activities. It also gives requirements for workplace labeling of hazardous chemicals. This scope also speaks to the hazard communication elements. So the standard includes the hazard communication elements for both, not both, for physical, health, and environmental hazards. And this standard, however, is not applicable to products such as human and veterinary pharmaceuticals, food products with trace levels of activities, or pesticides. And as pesticides are covered by another CARICOM regional standard, CRS 39. And this scope goes a little further to indicate that some areas that are not included in the standard, right? So the standard does not include establishment of test methods to determine health or environmental hazardous properties, all right? It does not include that at all, right? And it does not include risk assessment, risk management, or does it speak to country chemical inventories or chemical profiles? And the standard does not directly address biohazards or radioactive substances or waste, radioactive hazards, as those are covered by the set of IAEA documents. Adrian also spoke to the adoption of the GHS building blocks, but just for the purpose of the standard, it utilizes the following GHS building blocks, and A, the physical hazard classes and categories, the health hazard classes and categories as outlined in clause 10, and the environmental hazard classes and categories as outlined in clause 11. So clause 6 speaks to the classification of hazards. This is clause 6 of the standard. 6.1 speaks about the principles, the general principles of the GHS classification. And it identifies in that clause the party responsible for classification and labeling. 6.2 speaks to the sequence to be used for the classification of mixtures. When you have mixtures of different chemicals, different substances, what is the sequence of determining how you put the label, how you classify and how you label? Consideration is also given in the standard for synergistic and antagonistic effects of mixtures. So different components of a mixture might interact and affect the potency of another element of that mixture. And then you also have in 6.4 the full classification requirements for physical hazards, right? So the process of classifying and the classification requirements. Hazard labeling is contained in clause 7, and it goes through the whole process, and we have all of the different parts of the standard of the clause listed there. The label elements are provided, the pictograms and the reproduction of the hazard pictograms, the codification of the pictograms, I think Adrian did mention some of the codes and how do you know what the code refers to. Information that is required on the GHS label is in 7.4. When you have multiple hazards, what is the precedence for the hazard information? Arrangements for presenting the labels. Then you also have supplemental information in 7. The use of the color pictograms, and then also 7.9, the labeling of small packages. And we spent considerable time in the RPT looking at how we present this part of the standard, and determining also what we mean by small or very small packages and so on. Then we also looked at workplace labeling in 11 and consumer product labeling based on the likelihood of injury is contained in 7.12. And clause 8 basically speaks to the requirements for the preparation of the safety data sheet, what it must contain, how it ought to be done, and so on. So clause 9 now is the clause that speaks to the labeling requirements for the physical hazards. So we had the classification requirements in the previous clause. Now we are looking at the labeling requirements. And remember I said that the classification requirements are mostly referred from the GHS. For the labeling requirements, though, we have pulled out the GHS requirements and actually placed them in the standard. So 9.1 speaks to the onus being on the responsible party for the labeling. It speaks to the target audiences and the relevant information needed by those target audiences on the hazardous chemicals. It speaks about the comprehensibility of the information, and this is very important because what you don't want is for the target audience to find the information there, but they don't understand it or readily understand it. You want to ensure that they see the thing, they understand what it means. All right. And so the comprehensibility of the information is a vital thing. And then we speak to label preparation in clause 9.4, the allocation of label elements and the label elements of different classes and categories. And this is perhaps the longest subclause of the standard, where it speaks to the 17 different classes and then categories. Then clause 10 speaks to the classification and labeling of health hazards and the requirements for those, and the different classifications are there: the acute toxicity, skin corrosion, eye damage or irritation, respiratory or organ or reproductive toxicity, germ cell mutagenicity, carcinogenicity, reproductive toxicity, specific target organ toxicity, and aspiration toxicity. And that's all the labeling requirements for classification and labeling for health hazards are in clause 10. Clause 11 speaks to the requirements for classifying and labeling environmental hazards. And then 10.1, we have the definitions. And then 10.2, the classification. And then we have 10.3, chemicals and mixtures hazardous to the aquatic environment. And 10.4, chemicals and mixtures hazardous to the ozone layer. So that's the environmental hazards covered in clause 11. And that would be all that is in my presentation. Thank you so very much for your attention.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Gordon. I think we can all appreciate the degree of consideration and compilation that went into these two regional standards, right? That is now presented to you all for discussion. So just for the interest of time, we will go directly into the question and answer session. So of course, the panel comprises of all of those the speakers, sorry, that we had since the start of the session. So we have Ms. Mara Abraham, we have Ms. Dana Lewis, we have Mrs. Adrian Stewart, and we have Mr. Junior Gordon, who will be part of the panelists. And we also have Ms. Shalina Ruplal, right, from the BCRC Caribbean, who will also be joining in this particular session. So just to introduce Ms. Ruplal, she would have joined the BCRC Caribbean in September of 2021. She has attained a Master's of Business Administration with specialization in Logistics and Supply Chain Management and a BSc in Chemistry and Management. Under the Jeff Islands project, Ms. Ruplal is currently leading the activities pertaining to the conduct of a training needs assessment on the chemicals and waste MEAs, development of a digital learning hub, development of a sustainable training program on pesticides registration and PVC waste management. So I invite Ms. Ruplal to join the rest of the panel, and we will officially open up the session for any questions, any comments. Of course, I trust that we are familiar with the tools that are available on Zoom. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand and we will, you will be selected and you can open your mic and you can indicate if it is that you have a preference of who you would like to direct that question to. Alternatively, you can also type the question in the chat and between Mr. Prasad and myself, we would be able to pass on that question to the panelists. Okay, so I now invite any questions from those participants, from the stakeholders. Don't be shy.
Miss Susan Benassari Kiru has raised her hand. Please go ahead.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for sharing all this information. My question is based on the standard. How have you all dealt with the section on disposal considerations? So just historically, a lot of the current SDS would have very generic ways in which to dispose of the product after being used. So I do at times struggle with how we manage the disposal part of it. So I just wanted to know if you all would have elaborated on this section in the standard.
I am going to suppose that that question might be for me. Well, first of all, the standard essentially only speaks to classification and labeling. Now, the label that is placed on a container or on a substance may speak to how it is to be disposed of, but that information is usually captured in the safety data sheet. I note that you indicate that sometimes it is just general information that is provided there and sometimes not very specific to the product. And as we move forward and we look at the criteria for the safety data sheet, then that is information that we can reasonably request to be on the safety data sheet. It probably is not going to be on the label itself, but it can be on the safety data sheet. And so I am suggesting that as we go forward, that any request for information on disposal, specific information on disposal, can be something that is required on the safety data sheet. It's because that's where that information is normally captured, and you want to make that as specific as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Gordon. Does that answer your question?
Somewhat so, yes.
Okay. Here we have Mandy Benjamin. Feel free to pose your question.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. The session has been very, very, very inspiring, educational to me and my association, the Dominic Healthcare Association. My question is, in terms of labeling, what happens if a country imports chemicals that are not properly labeled, especially in a foreign language, and is put up on shelves for sale? How would the Bureau deal with that issue? I know that Mr. Lewis said that it has to be labeled from inception, but something can happen and comes in without the proper English labeling. How do we deal with that here? Thank you.
Mr. Gordon, you
I'll
want to...
take that one.
Yes, I thought Adrian would take that.
Yes. So most products that are not accurately labeled or mislabeled, most chemicals, let me start by saying most chemicals are governed by legislation within the member states. Member states may have differing legislation, but most legislation would have that the name of the product, or at least the information on the labels, should be easily read by the nationals of that particular country. And for us, it's in English. For Suriname, it would be in Dutch and or English. So that's usually a requirement. And most hazardous substances come under particular agencies, and they would have their legislation. Or where there is no legislation, there would be some overarching legislation that would speak to labeling of products. However, each country now has their own system for dealing with those products. So it's very difficult for me to say, in St. Lucia, this is what they do, or in Dominica, this is what they do. But each country would have agencies that would monitor the marketplace for products that do not comply. And in such a case, those products may be pulled from the shelf, because it depends again on how the legislation is structured. The agencies themselves may remove the product from the shelves, or the company that has brought that product in or is manufacturing that product would be asked to remove the products from the shelf, or they may also be asked to relabel. So usually those are the ways in which products that the labeling does not comply. That is the way that it would be handled in the member states. Now, there's a responsibility also, not just on the agencies that have the responsibility or the mandate for overseeing the markets for particular products, but consumers also have a responsibility as well to flag these agencies, and say, listen, I'm seeing X product in X shop or wherever it is. that's inaccurately labeled, not in compliance with the labeling. I can't, or just say I can't read the labels in a foreign language, so that they know that they can go and check out that place, because we all understand the resources that we have in the region. And sometimes the agency may not be aware that somewhere in some district, somewhere that there is this issue going on. And so they need to be alerted to the fact that that's happening there. But different countries will have different ways of dealing with it, depending on their legislation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stewart. Thanks for that question, Mandy. So we will take one question, the question from Ms. Smith-Lopez, and then we'll go to the chat because there's a question there as well. So,
All right. Hi, good morning. My name is Lisha Smith-Lopez. I am a technical officer at SwimCall. So the disposal aspect, thank you for the presentation, all the information. This really piqued my interest, especially with regard to the disposal aspect. And I see a couple of questions with regard to disposal. So on our end, I know this is more so on the hazardous substances from manufacturer labeling, but on our end, we see the bulk of the madness when it comes to the waste aspect. Excuse me. And my question is, with regard to how we go about labeling or understanding the hazardous waste, substances when it becomes waste now, because I know it could change over time, their composition could change, interactions with other substances, or it may even have contamination. How do we take this into account? Is there any kind of labeling aspect to regard to that? So that's my first question. Do I break up the questions or do I continue with? I just have two more.
Okay. Go ahead. Let's hear the question.
No, go ahead, Mr. Gold. You want to answer it? You wanted to ask all three questions, or would you like to take that question at this point?
All right. I could posit an answer to that question. You see, when the product becomes waste, and sometimes it's just a container of the product that is left behind, but it is still contaminated with whatever the product was that's in there. That now falls into a different category, a different process for treatment. And the standard as it is now would not speak to the waste aspect of it. That is one of the other standards that we believe should be developed within the region, so that we can have that, again, that common knowledge and understanding of how to treat with waste. But the classification and labeling standard would not address how you deal with the waste at this point. The labeling standard does speaks to the definitions and so on, but at the moment, the classification and labeling standard does not speak to it. That would have to be a separate standard to be developed.
Okay. Yeah, we do definitely have challenges with that. So I do oversee special waste, which does encompass hazardous waste at times. So sometimes companies would generate a waste type, and even though they have been doing it for years, they may not know the exactly proper disposal method. So we get asked now, what is the process? So I know it was mentioned before that they could go to a company that they got the substance from or the material from and ask, but sometimes they themselves don't have the information. Also, we had an interesting experience during COVID where companies were closed for a while, labels fell off. We had schools who had chemistry labs and the labels faded and they did not know what to do with them. So of course, as the the waste management company in Trinidad and Tobago, we were asked what was the process. So what I advised was to go, I see a question with that as well in the comments, to go to a treatment service provider or to get some type of testing from a laboratory, an independent third-party certified laboratory that can be able to tell them what the waste type is, and then we could further advise on what is the best process, because of course we can't landfill something that we don't know what it is due to the precautionary principle. And yeah, so my main concerns, but I think you answered my other questions with saying that it may not consider the waste aspect, but that is the main concern, because people bring or ask about some crazy stuff. Sometimes they mix all their waste together thinking it will be best. And we're like, please don't do that, because it becomes, the chemistry has become even worse with hazardous substances, and even throughout the life cycle, it becomes a mess. And we look at hazardous waste on the landfill aspect as waste more holistically, or more in a broader perspective, where we want to safeguard human health, public health, the environment, the landfill, even our equipment as well. So I look forward to the standard that would include the disposal aspect, because that is the main problem that we have locally, I would say, especially what we see coming into swim call. But thank you. You answered, basically answered my other questions with saying it may not encompass the disposal aspect.
Thank you, Ms. Smith-Lewis. Ms. Smith-Lopez, sorry. In the chat, we also have a question from Sharika Balancing. Thank you to all the presenters for the excellent information. My question is, in terms of the disposal information that will be included on the STS, will this be contextual to the CARICOM infrastructure and facilities to deal with disposal of chemicals? So I think Mr. Gordon would have, kind of covered that with the last response that he gave. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Mr. Gordon.
Yes, I would want to, because when it comes to disposal, there might be particular requirements internationally for the disposal of substances. And whether or not the country or the region has the infrastructure to carry out that specific kind of disposal is a question, yes, but when we look at the international sphere, we cannot then contextualize the disposal information to fit the infrastructure that we have. What we have to do is to ensure that the disposal is done in an environmentally friendly manner, that it is done using what needs to be used. And if we don't have the infrastructure in the region, we have to then have arrangements, agreements with other countries elsewhere who have the infrastructure to carry out that kind of disposal on our behalf. Meanwhile, if necessary, we begin to look at how we create the infrastructure to effectively take care of the kind of disposal that we have to deal with chemicals. Because you see, if we try to fit the disposal information into the context of our infrastructure, we might run into some problems internationally. We might create a worse problem. So I think we have to take the approach that I suggested that we take as we look at how we dispose of chemicals regionally.
Thank you, Mr. Gordon. All right, so it seems that the topic of the disposal of the standards is very pressing and very, very warranted, right? In the chat, there are a couple of comments that kind of deals with the possible disposal standards. So again, Stephen Mendez has indicated that would be a critical next step given our proximity to a shared marine space. And Mr. Ali has basically stated that this standard on disposal should encompass the provisions of the Basel Convention for transboundary movement of hazardous waste, as disposal of hazardous waste require very specific and approved international treatment and requirements. Okay, so of course that is some consideration moving forward. So we are.
And Chair, let me, if I might just give a quick example. Take, for example, in the electricity providing sector, where we have these drum type transformers that are on the utility poles, and they contain liquids. The liquid is hazardous. And I don't know whether or not most countries in the region would have capabilities to be able to effectively dispose of those in an environmentally sound manner. And so what usually happens is that the electricity companies usually have arrangements with the companies from which they source these, so that when they are no longer in use, and when they have developed a certain quantity of the stuff that is no longer in use, then it would be sent back to them, so that they would then do the disposal. And there are several such arrangements that are available to small island developing states when we have to use certain chemicals that we don't have the capabilities to dispose of. Then the source from which we get those chemicals usually act as the place to which we return them for that safe disposal to take place.
Thank you, Mr. Gordon. So I see Mr. Alexander has his hand up, so we will be able to take that question. And we are quickly approaching our close-off time for the session. So, Mr. Alexander, could you quickly
Yes, good morning. Good morning, Peter Alexander from St. Lucia. Great presentation, but I have two questions. One, the standard, is it for agrochemicals or is it chemicals in general? Because I say this because some of the requirements for agrochemicals, say for example, this on the LD50 and so on, you will have a color band. But you may have, say, for example, pesticides for structural pest control and those pesticides that are used in the household, where when you review those pesticides, the color band does not, you will not see a color band on some of those pesticides. So how can the standard in terms deal with issues concerning household and pesticides for structural pest control? Thank you.
I think I can answer part of that question. This standard deals with all hazardous chemicals. The presentation with the color band, that part of the presentation was just dealing with pesticides alone. So that was just to show how you take the GHS and work it into a system for labeling of pesticides. So that was an example of that. And the same thing can be done for other types of chemicals. So that was just an example to show how the flexible the GHS is for labeling, and not just what we consider to be industrial chemicals, but also pesticides. So the GHS is really a standard that is used for all chemicals, and you use the sections within the GHS that applies to the particular chemical for which you may be importing or have in your country, or manufacturing in your country nationally. Yeah. So I think, yeah, I think that's my part of responding to the question. The rest of it, of course, has to do with how the agencies within the particular country treat with non-compliance in the marketplace. And that would be specific to each member state. I hope I answered your question, Cletus.
Yes, you do.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ms. Stewart. All right, so according to my time, it is 3 minutes after 12. I would invite you as the stakeholders to check in the chat. Mr. Prasad would have provided the link to the regional standards where you can access the two draft standards. And of course, any comments can be submitted by downloading the form. And you can email that comment form to Adrienne, right? Her email is provided in the chat as well. So I would urge you all as the stakeholders, as you know, those persons who would be interacting with these two particular standards, to peruse the standards and provide your comments to Ms. Stewart so that this can be passed on to the regional project team. I would now invite the panelists if they would like to provide any sort of closing remarks before we officially end the session today.
Go ahead, Mara.
Sure. No, I just wanted to encourage the members, the stakeholders from Trinidad should supply their comments to Trinidad. Okay.
Yeah.
But however, those from the other member states need to reach out to their NSBs. So Mr. Alexander is from St. Lucia, so he needs to reach out to his NSB to provide his comments. Okay, so in closing, I just wanted to thank everyone for attending this session. And I hope that you can review the documents and provide adequate comments. Thank you.
Thank you. I was going to say the same thing that Mara just said. The other member states, their bureaus will receive their comments. And I would just like to thank Dr. Mohammed for being here and for moderating for us today and doing such a good job. And thank all the participants for attending and participating by asking their questions. Thanks to the BCRC and of course, Mr. Gordon for their contributions to the consultation and bringing a greater understanding to the Jeff Island project and what is happening in the region. And that will assist our governments in ensuring that they meet certain international agreements and to also ensure that citizens of the Caribbean are safe when it comes down to the use of chemicals. Thank you very much.
Any comments from BCRC?
Good morning again, everyone. Well, good afternoon now. Thank you all so much for your participation. On behalf of our director, Ms. Joel Batchesing, and the entire BCRC team, we thank TTPS, Prosecute, team of consultants, all our stakeholders, Dr. Mohammed as chair as well, and all of you for participating. We look forward to the comments that will be received so that we can have these standards finalized and use it to protect our region from chemicals and waste. So thank you all again.
Thank you. Mr. Gordon, any closing comments?
From my standpoint, I just also want to say thanks to all the participants in this process and the BCRC, Prosecute, TTBS. But most importantly, I want to ask the participants here, as you take a look at the standards, please make your comments, contact your NSB, make sure that if you have a comment, it is not kept to yourself. You send it because it might impact the way the standard deals with any particular matter on going forward. So please do. It's always a good thing. And that's from me. Thanks again to everybody.
And thank you all. Thank you all to all the stakeholders, to all the participants. Right. Again, a reminder to be part of the process. And we hope very soon that we'll be able to finalize these two regional standards. And of course, we would be in contact and communication with all of those relevant parties. Okay, so you all have a great day and enjoy the upcoming weekend and be safe. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.